It was a stormy night when Sarah decided to visit the car wash. She had just left a dinner with friends driving along a lonely, winding road that led out of town. As the rain began to pour, she looked at the dirt splattering across her windshield. Her car was in desperate need of a wash. She had passed the same car wash 100 times but had never stopped. The building had always looked worn and dilapidated, with peeling paint and flickering neon lights that cast an unsettling glow. As she drove further along the road, the rain intensified, and the wipers struggled to clear the glass. She turned around and pulled into the car wash, hoping to at least get some relief from the relentless downpour. It was after midnight, and there were no other cars in the lot, which seemed odd. The car wash was typically open all night, but Sarah didn't think too much of it. She just wanted to get the job done quickly and head home. The place looked abandoned. The lights buzzed intermittently, casting strange shadows across the lot. There was no music playing in the background, and no sign of the usual employees who would typically greet her at a normal car wash. Only one figure could be seen in the small booth near the entrance, an older man with pale skin, his face obscured by shadows. His head barely moved as she pulled up to the booth. "Should I turn back?" Sarah muttered to herself, unsure of why she felt so uneasy. The empty lot, the quiet atmosphere, it all felt wrong, but she convinced herself that she was just being paranoid. It was probably nothing more than an abandoned establishment trying to survive in a town full of better, more modern car washes. With a sigh, she rolled down her window. The man behind the booth didn't say a word. Instead, he nodded, slowly, almost robotically. Without taking his eyes off her, he pressed a button on the console. The garage doors in front of Sarah slowly began to open with a low, creaking sound. As she drove through, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, but she tried to ignore it, telling herself that it was just the loneliness of the storm that was making her feel uneasy. She entered the wash bay, the cold, damp air biting at her skin as the machines rumbled to life. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she rolled forward into the wash bay. The small booth behind her faded from sight as she ventured deeper into the dimly lit space. The machines were huge, looming like strange industrial creatures that moved in slow, calculated motions. Their mechanical sounds were almost comforting in their predictability, but the absence of music or any sort of noise made the environment feel unsettling. She glanced to the side, expecting to see the worker from the booth following her in, ready to guide her car through the wash. Instead, the only sound was the water and soap hitting her car's surface. The man hadn't appeared. In fact, she hadn't even seen him leave the booth. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to think of any other explanation. He might have gone to the back to prepare the wash or deal with another customer, but something about the situation felt off. She continued to watch the side mirrors, her breath fogging up the glass. The water splashed around her, almost too aggressively, as though the machines were angry at her presence. The faint whispering sounds began. At first, Sarah thought they were simply the machines working, or the wind pushing against the car wash walls. But as the whispering grew louder and more distinct, she realized it wasn't the wind at all. The sounds were words, soft and slithering, just on the edge of her hearing. She couldn't make out what they were saying, but a chill ran down her spine as the voices seemed to move closer. Sarah felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. Her heart raced as she tried to reassure herself. There was no way anyone else was in here. The wash was automated. No one needed to be here. The eerie sounds must have been an odd side effect of the machines malfunctioning, yet she couldn't shake the sensation that something was there. Her hands shook as she fumbled for the radio, desperate for some normalcy. She turned the dial, but the station came in static-filled and distorted. The whispers seemed to grow louder with the static, now unmistakable. "Help me," the voice hissed. "We are waiting." The grip on the steering wheel tightened as Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She turned her eyes back to the rearview mirror, but the booth was nowhere to be seen. She was completely alone, except for the whispers that now surrounded her. The car wash bay was designed to be efficient, nothing more than an assembly line of automated brushes and water sprays, each component working in unison to clean the car. Yet tonight it felt like an entirely different place. The hum of the machines grew more erratic, as though they were malfunctioning. The rubber brushes scraped against the side of her car with an unsettling screech, vibrating through the vehicle. It wasn't just the noise. It was the timing of it all. Every time a brush would touch the car, it felt as though someone was tapping lightly on the window. Suddenly, the washing sounds seemed to quiet down. The spray jets ceased, leaving only the faint, unnerving echo of dripping water. The temperature in the car seemed to drop, and Sarah shivered as the fog in the bay thickened. It felt like she was in a vacuum, cut off from the outside world. She couldn't even hear the rain anymore. The entire experience felt surreal. The whispering began again, this time much clearer. It was as though the voices were right in front of her, pressing against the glass. Sarah looked around frantically, her pulse racing, but there was no one there. She could feel her breath catch in her throat as the air in the car became thick and stifling. The voices weren't just speaking, they were pleading. "Get out," one whispered. "Help us," another one murmured, more urgently. "Join us," a third one hissed. Her panic grew with each passing second. The machines were malfunctioning, the lights flickering as though they were about to go out. Was she trapped here with something? She reached for the car's emergency brake, but as she did, she felt her seatbelt tighten, as though someone had just grabbed it and was pulling her back into the seat. She yanked at the seatbelt in a panic, but it wouldn't loosen. The sound of her own breathing seemed to become distorted, muffled by the growing sense of dread. She looked out the windows once more, but the fog now completely enveloped her car, turning everything outside into a gray, indistinct blur. The fog, thick and unnatural, began to seep in from the edges of the car wash bay. It was almost as if it was being generated by the machines themselves. It curled around the sides of the car like an ominous mist, quickly filling the entire bay. Sarah could no longer see anything outside the vehicle. The lights, which had once flickered ominously, now bathed the space in an almost suffocating glow. The fog seemed to have a life of its own, swirling around the windows and making the air feel damp and unnatural. She rolled down the window slightly, hoping for some fresh air, but instead, the mist rushed in, thick and cold, almost as if it were reaching for her. She could feel the moisture seeping into her skin, and despite the chill in the car, she was starting to feel unbearably hot. Her hands grew clammy as she wiped the condensation from the window. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't see anything. The world outside had vanished into the murky fog, replaced by a suffocating silent void. And then she saw it. A shadow, distorted and twisted, flickered just beyond her vision. It was moving, but not like a normal person. It crawled along the mist, a shape that could only be described as unnatural. Her breath hitched in her throat as the shape grew larger, more distinct. There were other shadows now circling her car, moving in ways that no human being could. She gasped and pulled her head back from the window, the fog pressing in harder against the glass. The whispers returned, now louder, more insistent. The shapes outside the car moved closer, their features hidden in the shifting fog, but Sarah could feel their presence as though they were right there with her, pressing in from all sides. The car suddenly lurched to a stop. The sound of the engine, stuttering, was loud and out of place against the stillness of the bay. Sarah quickly tried to restart the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. The key clicked in the ignition, but the car refused to start. Her heart began to pound as panic surged within her. This was no ordinary malfunction. The car had been fine moments ago, and now it was completely unresponsive. The fog swirled outside, pushing against the vehicle like an invisible force. The lights flickered again, plunging the bay into an even darker, more oppressive atmosphere. The whispers intensified, now becoming almost deafening in their urgency. "Help us. We are trapped." "It's too late." Sarah reached for her phone, but there was no signal, nothing but static on the screen. She turned her attention back to the controls, trying everything she could think of to get the car moving. But nothing worked. The car was stuck. The shadows that had been moving outside were now gathering closer, pressing against the car. She could hear their breath, ragged and cold, coming from all directions. She wasn't alone anymore. They were with her. The cold breath of the shadows seemed to fill the car, pressing against the glass. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as the whispers grew louder and more desperate. The shadowy figures outside appeared to be moving closer, their forms flickering in and out of existence as though they were trapped in the fog itself. They were silent now, but Sarah could feel their malevolent presence as though they were pressing in on her from all sides, waiting for something. Her breathing became shallow and erratic as she tried to keep her eyes on the shadows, desperate to make sense of what was happening. Was she hallucinating? Was this some sort of psychological trick, a product of the stress and isolation of the car wash? But no, she could feel it. The air was thick, as though something unnatural had taken root around her, and the weight of it pressed on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She turned her head to the rearview mirror, hoping to see something that might explain the situation, but there was nothing there, nothing except the thick, swirling fog. The figures outside were no longer just shadows. They were shapes now, tall, distorted humanoid forms with glowing eyes. Their movements were jerky, almost unnatural, as if they were caught in a struggle to break free from some invisible force that was holding them in place. "Let us in," one of them whispered in a voice that sounded like dry leaves scraping across the ground. Sarah shuddered at the sound, but as much as she wanted to scream, to fight back, she couldn't move. The shadows seemed to be closing in on her car from all directions now, the air thickening with an almost tangible malice. She tried to lock the doors, but they were already locked. The windows were rolled up tight, no way out. The presence around her was overwhelming. The coldness that seeped into her bones, the feeling that something was watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake, to show weakness. She could feel their eyes on her. She could almost hear them, breathing. Suddenly, the front of the car shook. It wasn't just the typical rumble of the wash machines working. The entire vehicle trembled as though it were being pushed from all sides. Sarah gasped as she looked out of the side window, her eyes wide with terror. One of the shadowy figures had placed its hand on the glass. Its long, gnarled fingers were pressing against it, and as it did, the glass began to crack under the pressure. Her hands instinctively flew to the door handle, but before she could act, the whispering voice returned, louder now, filling her mind. "Join us." The pressure on the car continued to build, the shadowy figure outside seeming to press harder, as though it wanted to pull her out of the car. Her fingers were slick with sweat, trembling as she struggled to regain control of her own panic. The voice was no longer whispering, it was a commanding shout, reverberating through her skull. "Let us in." The fog swirled outside, becoming denser, turning the bay into an impenetrable abyss. Sarah could feel her skin tightening, her muscles stiffening as the chill inside the car intensified, and the temperature continued to drop. Something in the car creaked, something inside her mind, and for a split second, she swore she could hear something scratching from within the walls. Just as Sarah's panic reached its peak, the fog outside shifted, and she saw something that sent a jolt of terror through her body. Through the shifting mist, she saw the faint outline of the worker, the same man who had been in the booth when she arrived. But this time he wasn't behind the counter. This time he was standing at the far end of the wash bay, his pale face illuminated by the eerie glow of the lights. But something was wrong. His posture was unnatural, his body unnervingly still. His eyes, dark and hollow, locked onto hers, with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She froze, unable to look away from him as he stood motionless, staring into the car. His mouth barely moved, but the words that emerged from his lips made her blood run cold. "Stay inside." His voice was distant, distorted, and seemed to reverberate unnaturally in the thick fog. It was as though the words were coming from inside her own head, as though the man was speaking directly into her mind. But his lips didn't move. His expression never changed. He simply stood there, unmoving, like some kind of twisted apparition. The car trembled again, but this time, it wasn't from the pressure of the shadowy figures outside. It was from something else, something much more terrifying. When Sarah glanced back at the booth, she was horrified to find that the space where the worker had been standing was now completely empty. There was no sign of him, no shadow of his figure lingering behind the booth. It was as though he had vanished into thin air. A strange, sickening silence filled the car wash as the fog thickened, swallowing everything whole. Sarah turned back to the rearview mirror, searching desperately for any sign of the man. There was nothing. The wash bay, which had once been so full of noise and motion, now felt like a graveyard. And then, with a sickening jolt, she realized that the handprint on the counter, the one she had seen in the booth earlier, was still there. It was fresh, blood-stained. The smeared red marks that had once seemed like an odd detail now seemed like an omen. As the fog pressed in, the shadows outside became bolder, more animated. They began to press closer to the car, their movements no longer jerky or distant. The figures were now fully formed, their twisted faces visible through the mist. They were no longer trying to get in. They were already inside. Sarah felt a deep, primal terror as she realized the truth. She wasn't trapped in the car wash anymore. She was trapped with them. And then, she saw him again. The worker, standing in front of her car, only now he was no longer just a man. His skin was pale, stretched too tightly over his skull, his mouth pulled back into a grotesque, mocking grin. His eyes glowed a sickly yellow and his face seemed to contort as he stared at her with malevolent delight. "Too late," he whispered. "We've been waiting for you." The car's engine sputtered one last time, then went dead. The shadows outside crept closer, their faces warping into horrifying, inhuman shapes. Their eyes were the same, glowing with hunger. Sarah's hands flew to the door, but before she could even attempt to escape, the door handle twisted itself, locking her inside. The windows fogged up instantly, and through the thickening mist, she could still see the worker's twisted grin. Took a step forward and everything around her went dark. The last thing Sarah heard before everything went silent was the voice, whispering one final time, as though it were coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Welcome home."